and welcome back to the Muscle Engineer podcast. I am, as always, your host, Szoták Andrei, and you're listening to episode 18, which is a special episode for me because this was my very first time where I wasn't on the host side of the podcast, and I was actually featured as the guest on my buddy Ábel Csabai's Sustainable Self-Development podcast that I'm sure that many of you will already be familiar with. Ábel and I, we've been in touch for a long time now, for years, and I had the absolute pleasure and honor to be featured on his podcast, considering the amount of incredible guests he's had on previously before me. In this episode, we discussed a lot of things related to progressive overload, what it actually means, at least for me. How should you go about progressing training? How should you go about overloading week by week? Whether you should add sets or not? What's a realistic set number? What are the issues with adding sets? Progressing in weight versus other methods? What to do when you can no longer just progress in weight linearly? And lots of other similar topics. So if you're interested, check it out. I hope you will enjoy it and stick around until the end, but I will, as always, give my top 3 takeaways from this episode. I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope you won't mind listening to me more than usual.
All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. And in this episode, I'm talking with Szoták Andrei. You have seen his name on my podcast being featured already because I was on his podcast, the Muscle Engineer podcast, and we did a really cool episode on ad libitum dieting and so-called intuitive eating, which from now on is actually being called autoregulatory eating. But anyway, I was on his podcast. We did a real cool talk, and I posted that episode on my channel. And in this case, he will be on my channel, and we are going to talk about everything related to progressive overload. What are better and worse ways to overload your training? Should you add in sets? Should you work up to your so-called maximum recoverable volume? Or should you just add weight every week? So all that good stuff, and we will see how that goes. So Andrei, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited too to talk to you because you know a lot about the topic and you're a real nerd on everything related to training, which makes you an awesome candidate for this kind of a talk. So just say something about yourself in a few sentences. What should people know about your fitness journey, and how long have you been how long have you been digging into the science and all the interesting stuff related to hypertrophy, and kind of what do you do in your everyday work, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not well known, so I guess I can afford to go in a bit more detail if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Because there are those people who have told their life, I guess, 105 times, and for the 106th time it can be a bit boring. Yeah. But essentially, I was born in a small village in Transylvania in Romania, and I grew up pretty much playing football because that's what we did. And I was, I guess, kind of chubby or overweight most of my life. And in late 2010, my first girlfriend dumped me, which was a fun experience, as you can imagine. And essentially, I got very pissed, and I needed an avenue to kind of let out my rage, so to speak. And I had a friend who had some weights in his basement, so I started messing with weights. And just to give you some insight into my baseline strength, the first time I laid back on the bench, I essentially got buried by a 20-kilo bar. So there's that for baseline. Yeah, so then in 2011, I joined the first proper gym, and then I kind of joined the Romanian equivalent of the bodybuilding.com forum, and I still remember this vividly. I think I may have told you this previously, but essentially I got banned because one night I said that, I had sugar in my cottage cheese, and that was a blasphemy back in the day because you can't do that because you will automatically gain fat. So I got turned off by that side of the internet, and I started seeking out more reasonable people. And I came across, I think it was back in 2012, I came across Eric Helms on Matt Augustus' channel when he did those Q&A series in his white t-shirt. I think you can still find those. Mm-hmm. And that was great. And gradually I got exposed to the people most will be familiar with, Eric, Lyle McDonald, Mike Islater somewhere down the line. So essentially I've been in the evidence-based circle for, almost 6 years. just contributing to discussion, initially reading, then giving my thoughts, I guess, which were probably dumb at the beginning, and then have gotten progressively less and less dumb. And back in somewhere last year in July, something like that, I started helping out Renaissance Periodization with some of their social media content. And somewhere at the beginning of this year, I got sort of accepted under an internship under Mike Israel, if you want to call it that. So essentially, I started taking on online coaching clients under his supervision, and he reviews the diet and training programs I write for them. And other than that, I also work as a personal trainer at the local gym here in Romania. So essentially, most of my days are spent between in-person clients, online clients, and then recording and editing my podcast whenever I have time for that, and the occasional social media interaction and reading interesting stuff, listening to podcasts and all that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's nice to see that you are turning into a true fitness professional, not like you weren't so far, but in terms of actual occupation. I mean, I know that you were a personal trainer thus far, but I remember the first time we interacted, you were, just kind of one of those enthusiastic commenters on different platforms. And, now you're really getting into the industry, and you're working together now with some of those people that you used to admire. So that must be a pretty cool feeling for you.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to mention that I remember a couple of years ago, I came across your channel and I was actually astonished that you had Danny Lennon on, and I don't know, you had a couple of people I really look up to, and I was like, wow, a Hungarian sounding and looking guy interviewed Danny Lennon and all these guys, wow. And right now I'm here in the guest spot, I guess, so I'm really appreciative for this.
Yeah, no, it's really cool how it's a special industry in the sense that people are, even though they're big stars, like they're almost like celebrity status in our sphere, but they are very helpful, and they are always willing to talk to you. So yeah, I was amazed too, like when I started out, that I could get some of these people to talk to me. And to this day, I can only think back to just a handful of occasions where someone turned me away saying that, like, yo, dude, you need to build up your platform a little bit more before I get onto your podcast. Like 90+% of the cases, they were super, super helpful. So yeah, it's a cool industry to be in for that reason. Yeah, maybe let's slowly transition into our topic today, which will be training related. I know that you're a big experimenter with your training, and you like to try out different stuff on yourself. I heard you mention this when you had on Børge Fagerli, who talked about his zero carb experiment, and you said that you like to experiment more so with training. So let's talk today about progressive overload, because this is something that everybody knows that it's a key to making our training effective, not just in the short term, but to keep making it effective over time. But a lot of people have misconceptions about what progressive overload really means. So I don't know. Do you want to give, like, if someone's coming up to you and asks you these days, what does progressive overload mean? How would you describe that concept to them?
Yeah, so fundamentally, I'm a bit of a pragmatist, if I might call it that. So I'm not that smart, and I try to follow people who are smarter than me, but I don't like to say that I do my research, because I definitely don't do my research in my apartment, but I try to look at people who are smarter than me and who like or can use sciencey smart terms, but I'm not that cool. So for me, progressive overload or applying progressive overload for a given muscle is just increasing the demand of that particular muscle over time. So if you just go back to that definition, then we can automatically circumvent a couple of issues that people seem to have in practice. And I don't know if you want to get into that right away, or...
I guess we can jump right in, and we can circle back later if we have to.
Yeah, okay. So my biggest issue with how people sort of apply progressive overload in practice is that they somehow forget that, like I said, the goal is to challenge the muscle more and more over time, or to expose it to an over-increasing demand over time. So they seem to conflate that with just loading more weight on the bar or on the leg press, because that seems to be one of the favorite tools for people to to use. And it kind of turns into this progressive weight overload, or progressive ego overload, or progressively degraded execution overload. So, if you want to rate your execution on a imaginary 1 to 10 scale, let's say someone uses 10 kilos, for example's sake, and their execution is at 6 or a 7, then they might go up to 12.5, and the execution might go down to 4 or 3. So this is what most commonly is practiced by most people at most gyms. And I'm talking about regular gym goers here, that they kind of forget what the goal is, and by increasing the weight that they are using, they're actually decreasing the demand that the musculature is placed under. So the target muscle, even though you are using a quote-unquote, or even though you have applied the quote-unquote progressive overload, the muscle is actually doing less work. So I guess that's where the whole fundamental misconception is. That's where the baseline has to be set. It doesn't matter what weight you're using. What's matter is, some smart people have said it before me, it doesn't matter the load, or doesn't matter what loads you're using. It matters how well that load is directed. So you can use a weight that's 20% lighter, and the particular muscle can be worked more efficiently or more effectively.
Yeah, and I guess maybe we can jump into, because it's just a practical way to illustrate this, but a lot of people seem to confuse progressive overload with, and I heard Eric Helms talk about this, so I'm kind of quoting him, but I think it's a really good way to illustrate this, is that a lot of people confuse progressive overload with a progression scheme. So, putting weight on the bar, and I used to be of this confusion a lot as well. I used to think that I am growing bigger by the act of lifting more weight in a given workout. So if last week I benched 80 kilos for 8 reps, and the next week I'm benching 82.5 kilos for 8 reps, then that increased weight and benching that for 8 reps is what was actually what caused the progression. Whereas in reality, the progression actually happened as I was adapting to that last week's training stimulus. And now, as a result of that, I was able to bench more. So I guess it's, in that regard, progressive overload is a necessity to induce further adaptation in your training, but it's also a tool to actually track your progress, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think what you mentioned there is a quote from Brian Miner that I've seen him post in a blog post and on Instagram. It was something to the effect of lifting more weight is a byproduct of past performance, but isn't necessary for improved performance, something like that. So the gist of it was that what you said previously, that what you did in the past allowed you to lift more weight, but isn't, or getting bigger, lifting more weight isn't a requirement to get bigger, something like that. So, and in essence, sure. So to go back to the practical side, my biggest issue is when someone increases their load. Like I said, in an ideal world, in an ideal situation, if you kept everything constant and you indeed increased your bench weight, whatever, to 82.5 kilos from 80, then yes, that should have been or should be a more effective or a bigger stimulus for that particular musculature. And given that you can actually recover from it and you sleep and you have the nutrition and all that, then yes, that should elicit a hypertrophic stimulus for that particular muscle. But like I said, in practice, there are some issues with this. People can just simply arch more. So they can arch their lower back more, or they can lift their butt up the bench. So essentially they meet the bar higher, or they can not bring the bar to the previous point that it was a week ago. I didn't say they bring the bar to their chest, because that's a different discussion and debate altogether, whether you should touch the bar to your chest or not. Yeah. But essentially whatever that end range of motion was the last week.
Yeah, so let's talk about adding weights to the bar, because that's I guess one of the most straightforward way to progress with your training, or progressively overload your training. And perhaps the thing that most people, when they come across the concept of progressive overload, the most two common ways of doing it is adding reps and adding weight, but probably adding weight is the most common way of doing it. Basically, if you download any particular random cookie cutter program from the internet, it will have some sort of a progression model of maybe, okay, so you're lifting in the 8 to 12 rep range, and once you can do 12 reps, then you add weight, then you start from 8 reps again, going up to 12 reps again. That's a very typical way of doing it. So let's talk about adding weights to the bar. And I guess you touched on this in the beginning, that whenever, especially when you're trying to progress by adding weights to the bar, one really critical thing is that you keep other variables constant, such as form, so execution. You touched on that. One other thing that you touched on is, and that's something that I fell for a lot of times, and I think it's in the real world, it's hard not to fall for this, is that people just incrementally get better at grinding. So maybe they start off with 80 kilos on the bench and they can do that for 8 reps, but maybe they stopped at a very decent, maybe like 2 or 3 reps shy of failure, and they get more and more enthusiastic. And they just get closer to failure, and at the end veins are popping out of their forehead and they can barely lift the weight for 8 reps, and at the end of it they plateau and they don't understand why. And it's like, well, you kind of just pushed yourself to the limit so much that now it's really hard to progress, because those last weeks of progression were just as a result of you just being really, really hard at just eking out reps where really you probably should have wrecked the weight before that. So yeah, like what would you say are the benefits and the downsides of just progressing by adding weight to the bar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think first and foremost, we have to kind of define or specify what population we're talking about. So in the actual gym setting in person, I deal with mostly beginners or untrained. By that I mean untrained people who have never been at the gym, because in Romania especially, personal training is pretty expensive. So usually the people who will actually pay for that kind of premium service are those who have never been at the gym, and they're kind of intimidated, and they are just kind of unsecure or unsure of themselves. So they're like, well, I might as well just pay someone teach me how to do things. And that's an excellent way to look at it, actually, instead of just going to the gym and doing whatever and hoping for the best. So when it comes to that particular population, I think increasing weight is a perfect way to do things after you've established some good execution. So the first couple of weeks, even though the primary goal is to actually establish a proper movement patterns, and they just get them familiar with the gym setting first and foremost, and being there and all that. But after that, you have to teach them how to actually set up for exercises, and we can do a separate podcast about that particular topic just in and of itself. But you can teach them how to set up, how to align their joints and keep their bodies and all that. But once that's particularly addressed, or at a sufficiently good level so that they don't have an injury risk, or their form is not so poor that they might hurt themselves, then you can actually start increasing weight. And the two kind of happen simultaneously, even though I try not to push them. So for beginners, I definitely wouldn't recommend going to failure, like you said. And I know many trainers do that, but that's probably the dumbest thing you can do with an untrained guy. Because like you said, and you touched on the grind aspect, they kind of, everything is new for them. So they don't know how to do the exercises, and then they don't know how to grind. I mean, at the first sign of, and they're kind of scared and shocked, and you're like, what the hell happened? Here, it burns. Yeah. You're like, oh, okay, cool, chill down. That's okay, that's normal. That's just the burn. You're going to get used to it. And they're like, really? But it hurts. It's like, okay, you're going to get used to it. And after a while, they start to get used to it and they enjoy it and all that. But simply, they don't have the capacity to grind. And usually once the movement kind of slows down, they automatically re-rack the weight. And that's completely fine. I usually leave up to them. I just tell them, look, whenever you feel like you're getting tired and the weight is starting to feel heavy or challenging, just stop the set. And that's perfectly fine with that particular population, because they really don't need more than that. Because when you're so new to this, essentially any well-directed stimulus will get you results. So in that population, I would say up to maybe a year of training, increasing weight is an excellent strategy, especially if you're working with someone. Because if you don't, then they can do whatever they want and they can spend 5 hours at the gym if they want. But usually I have an hour with the client, so I'm limited in the amount of, I'm limited by the number of exercises I can do with them, and that's a bit intentional as well. You don't want to do 25 exercises with a beginner. You're much better off picking 4 effective ones and actually getting somewhat proficient at those. But kind of the whole neurological learning and the nervous system adapting and all that simply will result in them being able to handle more weight. And then, of course, you get the actual muscle increases, muscle size increases, and they get a bit better at actually tolerating that sensation of fatigue and burn and all that. So if you talk about someone who has been training less than a year, I think keeping the number of sets low, maybe I like to keep it at maybe 3, but usually 2 sets per exercise. So take as many warm-up sets as needed, but then do only 2 working sets. And someone might say, well, that's low. When you've only been training for a couple of months, that's not, especially if you do like 2 to 3 exercises per muscle group per week. So you might do 6, 7, 8 sets per week. And for someone who has only been lifting for a couple of months, that's perfectly fine. And as long as they increase their weight, the weights they are using, and keeping their form, I wouldn't say perfect, because when you deal with someone who is relatively untrained, their form is never going to be perfect, but it's got to be good enough so they don't hurt themselves, and they can execute the exercises safely.
And what about more advanced people? So I guess, like, how realistic is it to, because everybody has those honeymoon phases in their training when we can just keep adding 5 pounds or 2.5 kilos every week to every lift, but it eventually all comes to an end. So I don't know, what do you think are some viable ways to keep increasing training stress that way by keep adding weight? And I guess, like, one way to get around it would be to use micro weights, instead of adding 2.5 kilos, just add 1 kilo, or put some ankle weights with just 200 grams or something like that.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I gotta keep my own perspective in mind. So I've been lifting since 2011, so that's 7 years. So I don't want to sound arrogant, and I don't want to I don't feel particularly confident in addressing what someone who has been training for 27 years should do. But simply based on, because I wouldn't assume that most listeners have been training longer than 7 years, and if they have, then awesome. Perhaps I can tell us something that they can use as well. But like you said, after a point, yes, the weight your ability to increase weight week after week or session after session diminishes. So in that case, yes, there are a couple of things you can do. Micro loading is definitely one of my favorite ways to do. And unless your gym is, you are in that unfortunate situation where your gym has those machines that are enclosed. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but there are some gyms that have kind of cases on the weight stack itself. They are closed in, so you don't have access to it, which sucks. And kind of that's one of the ways you can tell if a manufacturer hired someone who has been actually lifting, or they just hired whoever to design their equipment. But if you're not in that situation and you actually have access to that weight stack, you can do 2 things. And one is to put a weight on the pin. So if the pin is long enough, you can just put it on the pin itself. If not, just put a secondary pin in the weight stack. So this way, if the next increment is, usually it's 5 kilos, but some machines go up in 8 kilos or even 10 kilos, which is just insane. Then you can simply put a 0.5 kilo or 1 kilo or 1.25 kilo weight plate, however, whatever the smallest increment is that's available to you. And by doing that, you can increase your the weight you're using by small enough relative percentage that you can actually do it for the decent amount of reps, and it's not. You don't want to drop down your reps from 10, and let's say you've been doing sets of 12 and you go up the next increment and you drop to 5 reps or something like that. So by doing this, you can actually provide a meaningful yet still reasonable increase to the weights you're using. And the second strategy is just to put a dumbbell on top of the stack itself. So there are, again, some stacks or that are close but have some space on top of them, so you can just simply dump a dumbbell on top of it. And I do that too, depending on the equipment. And you can use a 1 kilo dumbbell, a 2 kilo dumbbell, something like that. And that's a great way to increase your weight that you're using.
And I guess maybe that's a good segue to talk about another viable progression method, which is increasing reps, which, like, if you think about it with something like dumbbell lateral raises, where, I mean, everybody tried it or experienced it a few times, where maybe now you're doing a set of 15 with 5 kilo dumbbells, and then the next day or the next week you're trying to do it with 6 kilos. Maybe, again, you're able to do 15 reps. The week after, maybe the next increment is maybe 2 kilos more. And now all of a sudden your reps with that weight drop down to maybe 8 or maybe 10 from 15, which normally wouldn't happen with something like a compound movement, because you're able to overload that with 2.5 kilos. And maybe, with your training gauge, now you're too advanced to overload by 2.5 kilos from workout to workout. So your reps will be dropping by, maybe 1 or 2 on something like a bench press. But if you're doing something like a lateral raise, because 2 kilos is such an enormous relative increase, from 6 kilos to 8 kilos, now your reps are going to be dropping by 5. And in that case, maybe it might be actually more viable to just add reps. So I don't know. What do you think about, in general, what do you think about adding reps versus adding weight?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a couple of different progression strategies depending on the equipment or the exercise that's being used. So for compound and either free weight or plate loaded machines, what I like to do, because on those you have access to smaller plates and you're not limited by the next dumbbell or fixed barbell or something like that. So, or by the next weight stack or the next increment in the weight stack, as you would be in the case of machine. So what I do in that particular situation is select the rep range that I want to work in. Let's say it's a 6 to 8 or 6 to 10 rep range. And let's say I want to do 3 sets. Okay, so I want to do 3 sets of 6 to 10 reps with barbell bench press, to give an easy example. In that case, what I will do is do my first set and see, let's say I got 8 reps, and then on next I got 7 and 6. I will stick with that weight until I hit the top of the rep range in the first set, and then the second and the third land wherever in that particular interval. So if I got 10 on the first and on the second I got 9 and 7, then that's perfect for me and I can add weight. So next week I will add 1 kilo or 2.5 kilos, because that's more realistic, because most gyms have a 1.25 or a 2.5 pound increment. Very few gyms have actually smaller plates than that. But if you have, awesome. And I add the weight and then start again, and I might drop my reps to 8, 7 and 6 or something like that, and repeat. That's in the case of a plate-loaded machine, or in the case of a barbell or a leg press or something like that. So essentially anything that uses plates. If you talk about a machine that's that has a weight stack or dumbbells or something like that, then I won't increase weight as soon as I hit the top end of my rep range on the first set. But what I will do instead is wait until I hit the top of the rep range with all of my sets. So instead of doing, let's say I use your example of lateral raises and I use the 5 kilo dumbbells and I want to hit 3 sets of 12. And if I hit 12, 11 and 9, I won't go up to the 7.5 kilo dumbbells or the 6 kilos, whatever that's available. I will wait until I can hit all 3 sets of 12. So by that point, I should be able to go up to the 6 kilos and do at least 3 sets of 8 or something like that, and start again over. So I think that's the best way, and in this way you can adapt the strategy that you're using to the equipment that's or the exercise you're trying to apply it to. Because obviously you can do the same. You can use the second strategy on a barbell press or deadlift, something like that, but it's just not necessary because you don't really need to wait until you can hit all 3 sets of 10 or 12, whatever, because you can add some weight and still be able to fall in that rep range because the relative increases is not really that big. Whereas in the case of a dumbbell, like you said, some gyms I've seen have, after the 5 kilo, they only have a 7.5 kilo dumbbell. So that's, relatively speaking, a 50% increase in weight. I mean, that's just insane. Think about it. I mean, imagine like doing a bench press and using 60 kilos and then going up to 90 kilos. I mean, no one would do that.
Yeah, like what you mentioned about hitting a certain amount of reps in all sets. I think actually that's especially viable. I mean, it's kind of a side note, but I think it's especially viable if someone has a little bit questionable technique, or if someone is just kind of, if someone has been in the game for 20 years, like a Jeff Alberts, who, is everything, all reps look exactly the same, pristine form, then it might not be as necessary. But for someone who is still, kind of prone to error when things are getting heavy or when they are approaching failure, then it might be, for example, on squats, instead of saying, okay, 6 to 10 reps or something like that, just say, okay, once you hit 8 reps on all 3 sets, then we progress in weight.
Yeah, so in an ideal world, in a theoretically perfect world, the more training experience you have, the better execution is, the better your muscular recruitment is, the more control you have, the more essentially the more you can get out of each rep and each set. And I think that's if people want to look up someone or people who have what I consider a decent blend of not only execution but also using some amount of load, because one or the other isn't really useful. I mean, if you want to just go the load route, sure, you can go all in on Branch Warren style, but then you might find yourself every 6 months in the surgery room or something like that. And on the other extreme, if you're only focused on execution and having absolutely perfect reps, that's awesome. But if you're using 5 kilo dumbbells all your life, then you're not really going to amount to much. And yes, I know that there was that one study where that guy flexed his muscles hard enough and all that crap. Yeah, okay. That's where I kind of I have issues with people being too evidence-based and kind of wanting to apply the quote-unquote evidence, which in that case means just research, to real life circumstances. I mean, if you look at the best bodybuilders and the guys who are actually jacked, they are usually pretty strong. And this doesn't mean that they are world-class level strong, or the stronger you are, the bigger you get. But relatively speaking, especially from where they started, because just to give my personal example, I mean, yeah, my bench press is probably laughable for most people, but remember, I got buried by an empty bar. I was too weak to bench the bar. Whereas someone like Greg Knuckles, and I'm sure he doesn't mind me saying this, he has benched, I think, 120 something kilos on the first day he stepped into the gym, 275 the first day he stepped into the gym. Compare 275 to 30 pounds. So there you go. So relatively speaking, yeah, my bench might not be nothing noteworthy, but relatively speaking, I made a ton of progress. And if you look at it from this perspective at your own training, then perhaps you can appreciate your own progress better. But just before I lose my train of thought, so if people want to look up someone who has that particular blend of execution and effort, they should look up 2 people. They should look up Joe Bennett on Instagram at Hypertrophy Coach. And he's what I would call him a bit more on the execution side than on the load side. And the second guy should be Jordan Peters at Trained by JP on Instagram. And he is a bit more on the load side, but both of them have good enough execution. And you can see 2 guys who use, or absolutely speaking, impressive loads, especially Jordan, but Joe himself, I mean, he front squatted 160, 170 kilos, so that's not really bad, I guess, for most standards. And both guys have insane execution. So in their case, yeah, the quote-unquote rule applies that the longer you've been lifting, the better your execution should be. And in their case, they can get away with performing fewer sets because they can actually get more out of each rep. And I think this is why I really don't like the back and forth between, this guy uses high volume and this guy uses low volume and all that, aside from theoretical personal volume tolerances and all that. It might just be that, for example, Dorian Yates, because everyone likes to bring him up, it might just be that his muscle recruitment on those particular muscle groups was so good that due to whatever reason. Yeah, so it might have been the case that his muscle recruitment due to deliberate execution or just his structure or just his neurological wiring and whatever. His muscle recruitment was so good that he got all that he could out of those muscle groups in just a couple of sets. And beginners, usually they don't. So that's why you can see, usually intermediate, because beginners don't really do that, but intermediate guys who have been lifting for a year or 2 or 3, something like that, and you see them performing just insane amounts of volume, like 25, 30, 40 sets per week. And someone who has perhaps the experience of Joe or Jordan or I might call him even myself, and even I, looking back now, I would just be crushed by that volume. And I remember years ago, I think maybe 2 years ago, I actually had a phase for a couple of months where I actually did 50 sets for chest. I'm not even kidding, 50. I remember I did like 15 sets 3 times per week, and one of them was like 20. So, and my chest was, it was worse than it is now. And right now I do, I think 7 sets on average, 7-8 sets in one workout, and maybe 6 to 7 in the other. So that's still 15. And who knows, maybe 5 years from now, if we talk again, I might tell you that my recruitment and my execution got even better. So right now I can get the work done with 8 sets per week instead of 10 or 15. Who knows? But yeah, just to go back, I think I went on a tangent there for a bit. So for someone who is in that intermediate phase, yes, they probably would benefit from staying at that weight for longer. But also, even if someone is advanced and you have good execution and they know how to lift, essentially, they still, just due to the fact that they can make progress slower, it might just be a good strategy for them to repeat that same workout. Even if, let's say you did, and I do that for myself too. Let's say I went up from 50 kilos to 52.5. Yes, I was on paper, I was in that particular rep range that I wanted, but I know in my head that execution wasn't that good. Wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, or as good as it could have been. So I just might note in my logbook that repeat this again next week, and I might stick with the weight for 2 or 3 weeks. And on paper, you might look at it and go, wait a minute, you haven't been making any progress for the past 3 weeks. I mean, you've been lifting the same weight for the same reps for the same sets. And that's true, but what's happening internally, the challenge on that muscle is becoming progressively more or greater and greater. And I think that's what makes the difference. Because for example, if I have an online client and I only see their spreadsheet or their workout log, and I see them that they've did X numbers of weights for X number of reps, I might just think in my head, awesome, we can increase the load. And then I see their recordings, I'm like, holy freaking shit, okay, we're dropping back down the weight. And that has happened more times than I can remember, because just a number on paper doesn't really tell you much about what's happening internally. So go back to what you originally asked. Yes, I think repeating the workouts and trying to improve the quality of that work is probably one of the most underappreciated ways to induce progressive overload. If you go back to what I quote unquote defined it to be.
I do that frequently, actually. Like, I just stay at a certain weight, like on the machine seated leg curls. Actually, I think I stayed at, I know actually the increment, it's 65, whatever its unit is, kilos or pounds or whatever. I just see a 65 there. And I stayed there for like 3 weeks because I can just tell, like, there's no way, like, if I'm going to up the weight to 70, the form is going to look ugly. I'll just feel it in everywhere, all kinds of weird places other than my hamstrings. So I'm just going to stay there until I feel like I'm just able to complete this amount of reps with less straining, with just more ease, with better form, better execution. And once I feel like I'm quote unquote ready, then I'm going to up the weight. So yeah. And another thing I wanted to ask your opinion on, because this is something I'm always kind of on the fence with. So what do you think about down sets? So, dropping the weight in between sets and adding in more, so maybe you're, like I guess it's kind of a drop sets with rest in between, or reverse pyramid training is how a lot of people like to program it for themselves. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways I have seen this implemented. One is to just have separate rep ranges. And I know, for example, because I'm subscribed to Joe's website, he has a members website, and it's like $10 a month, so it's definitely well worth it. And well, you're welcome, Joe. I expect the check in the mail. Just kidding. But from what I've seen, he likes to do this. He might have a top set, and I have a couple of buddies who do the same. They might have a top set in the 5 to 8 rep range, something like that. And this is the failure. And then they drop down the weight by 10% or something like that. And then they have the second set in the 8 to 12 rep range, or 10 to 15 rep range, something like that. And that's one way to do it. I myself don't really practice that in a given session. That's just personal preference. I don't think there's a better or worse way to do it. I do something similar, but I do it in a DUP fashion, if I want to to use a smart sounding term. So I might have a 5 to 8 rep range on Monday, and then have the 8 to 12 rep range on Thursday. And again, I don't think one is better than the other, or one is inherently superior and inferior. I think it's just preference. But the other way to do down sets, and this is what I actually use, is to have a particular rep range, and then if you feel like you cannot remain in that rep range with the desired reps in reserve target, that's of course if you want to use that, and we can actually have a separate discussion whether training to failure and all that, and whether it should be applied or not. But let's say I want to remain in the 8 to 12 rep range, and first set with whatever X kilos, I only got 8 reps. I know that if I'm going to stick with the same weight for the next set, I'm going to get out. Essentially, I'm going to fall below that 8 to 12 rep range. So what I'm going to do is drop it down to the smallest increment, or reduce the plates on the bar or the whatever machine by the smallest increment possible. And in this way, I can actually remain in that rep range. And again, I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, or one is worse. Essentially, it accomplishes the same thing. At the end of the day, it allows you to do sufficiently high enough or sufficiently challenging work for sufficiently long enough time.
Cool. Yeah, I think we exhausted this one pretty well. And let's talk about something which is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is adding sets over time. And, I guess Mike Israetel made this kind of pretty famous now in the trenches, which is the working up to your MRV, or maximum recoverable volume. So maybe in a progression scheme like that, you would start out with what you deem to be the least amount of work that you can progress on, and then gradually work up to the most that you can tolerate. And, to add some more detail to that, so the way he would do that is that you would start out with a lower volume amount. So maybe let's say 10 sets. You think that that's the least that you can progress on. And you also start out with more reps in reserve. So maybe you're doing 10 sets per muscle group, and you're quitting each set when you feel like you could do 3 or maybe 4 more reps. And as the weeks progress, you add in more sets, and you're also increasing or decreasing your reps in reserve. So maybe by the time before you deload, so maybe you're working yourself up to 20 sets, by that time you're pretty darn close to failure. So what do you think about this progression method? I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this, mainly because I had the privilege and honor and to review Mike's original draft of the MRV Volume Landmarks book. And I'm actually mentioned at the beginning of the book, which is extremely it's a big honor for me.
Nice.
But yeah, so I had ample that. So my opinion has shifted somewhat in the last, as it's natural, as it should be actually. So my opinion has changed a bit during the months, and I guess this is now years since Mike has introduced the concept. So initially I thought that, okay, well, whatever, if you want to get the absolute max out of your training, then this is just what you have to do. And to a certain extent, I still think that if bodybuilding is your life, and by that, it is going to be controversial, but by that, I mean literally, bodybuilding is your life in the sense that it pays your bills and you're making a living out of bodybuilding, which I don't know how many people are, but whatever. And again, just as a tangent, but just because you have a natural pro card and you actually pay money and you lose money to compete, that doesn't mean that bodybuilding is your life. Bodybuilding is an expensive hobby at that point, but I digress. So if bodybuilding is your life and you want to make, for whatever reason, your absolute maximum amount of gains, then yes, I think that due to reasons Mike has expanded on in his book, which I mostly agree with in a theoretical sense, yes, there are some very good arguments for starting at a lower volume, gradually throughout the weeks, going up to your MRV and potentially exceeding it for a short amount of time. So always being in that maximum active volume or MAV stage. So essentially always getting the highest possible return from your training. Now, this is on a theoretical level. I think in practice, there are a couple of issues with this. First and foremost, the population that we are trying to apply this. So again, if I'm dealing with someone who goes to the gym 3 times a week and they want to look better and be fitter and healthier and play with their kids or become some girls, have a girlfriend and all that crap, all that fun stuff, sorry. Then does it really matter if you do, if you go to your MRV or just stick to a mid-range kind of volume and you get maybe 95% of your gains? Probably not. However, again, if you're Jared Federer and you're training 6 days per week, 2 hours a day, and you want to be a world champion bodybuilding pro, then awesome, have at it. But on the practical level, you did ask about increasing sets, right? Okay, so on the practical level, I think that after a certain point, it just becomes unreasonable, unrealistic. And I run into this issue with my online clients too, that, okay, you start with 2 sets per week, what usually I do, and then you go up to 3, okay. And now your workout time increases by X%, and then you go up to 3, and then you go up to 4, and then you go up to 5. And before you know, you're spending 2.5 hours in the gym, which is just 1, unreasonable, 2, unrealistic, and 3, probably unnecessary. So in that sense, I'm exaggerating a bit. Of course, if you do 5 sets in each exercise, you will probably exceed what would be considered your MRV. But just for the example's sake, I think after a certain point, doing more volume, it not only becomes unnecessary, but it becomes unproductive, especially due to the reasons I mentioned previously. Most people have such terrible technique that if they imagine someone who is barely able to do 6 quality sets per muscle group per workout. Now, if you want to bump up that to 12 or 15, I mean, the quality is just going to go to shit, realistically speaking. So yes, if someone has absolutely perfect execution and has it dialed in and wants to get the maximum out of their training and has everything else on point, so they sleep 8+ hours per night, they take naps throughout the day, they count every single gram of food they put in their mouth, they use every single supplement that they can realistically spend money on and all that, then yeah, maybe you can or you should do this kind of strategy if you want. But for the average guy who is going to listen to this, I don't think it's necessary, or it's going to be the most productive way to do things.
Yeah, it's, I mean, those are very good points. And I do think, though, that Mike would have a good response to all of those, you know, because he is admittedly not targeting the average Joe, you know, like even though he doesn't necessarily only attract people who are in that camp who live in, you know, the Jared Federer type of, you know, non-human people, like he does attract a lot of people who just want to look jacked on the beach. he's still kind of very much emphasizing very often that he is talking about how to get the absolute best results. But even then, I have some theoretical problems, which I would actually be super curious to hear his response to. But the whole premise of building up from a lower set number and working up to your MRV, for me, the theoretical issue with this is that, for one, it assumes, like, one thing he always says is that, okay, let's say that your maximum adaptive volume is 15 sets. So, and then he asks the question, why can't you just do 15 sets week in, week out? It's, well, because if you do 15 sets one week, the next week or the week after, 15 sets is no longer your maximal adaptive volume. I am just a little bit hard pressed to believe, or I have issues with the idea that your volume tolerance or what volumes you're responding best to changes that quickly. Like if 15 sets is a great amount of work for you one week, then the next week it's already too little. I think the body doesn't adapt to volume that quickly. That's one issue. But the other issue is kind of that, so let's say you have a 4-to-1 work to deload kind of paradigm, and you're starting off with 10 sets and each set is 4 reps away from failure. Like, to me, that's more of that would be an amount of stimulus that for a lot of people is more like a deload. Like if every set is 4 reps away from failure, I don't know, like, are you really getting a real training stimulus from that? You're getting some, but it's like, it's really borderline. It's almost like a light week. And then you're all of a sudden 3 weeks later, you're 1 rep away from failure and you're doing twice the volume, 20 sets, and then you're crushed. So you're 1 week you're barely doing anything, and then the other week you're like crushing yourself. So the amount of time that you're spending in that Goldilocks zone is very little. And then the final big assumption here is that you're taking a 1 week deload, and all of a sudden, half of that amount of work, 10 sets, is already an effective amount of volume for you, even though you already needed 20 sets to induce further adaptations. So I don't know. Those are some issues that I have with this concept, but I don't know.
Yeah, so you threw like 15 different things there, and I tried to take some notes, so hopefully I can address each of them. But I'm sure, like you said, I'm sure Mike would have some excellent responses, and I'm sure I would agree with most of them, again, on a theoretical level. So the issue when we have these kind of discussion is we talk about a hypothetical person. So we talk about someone in the outer space, someone who is trying to maximize their gains and all that. But we're not talking about XYZ person living in this particular town, in this particular city, in this particular situation. So when we extrapolate that to that particular scenario, and we talk about an actual human who has actual life issues and all that, then I think in a way it becomes exercising futility, because and again, I don't want to sound like oh my God, I've been doing this for 25 years. I've had 10,000 clients under my belt. No, but I have had decent enough exposure that I have already experienced. Like, it's not uncommon for someone to say, well, I'm not trained today because X, Y, and Z, or well, I have to train today because tomorrow I can't train. And then what? Because you had this all planned out, and you're going to do this much volume on this day, and tomorrow you're going to take a rest day. So you have the perfect SRA curve, stimulus recovery adaptation, and then you have the perfect setup for Thursday and all that. And then everything is thrown out the window. Or my baby was crying all night, so I couldn't sleep. So what about that high volume like that I'm supposed to do today? I can't do that, So these are the particular real life issues that we have with. And again, I know that this has nothing to do with Mike is arguing about. I'm sure his response would be that, yes, well, then sort your life out. Then obviously you're not in a position to go for this kind of training. And yes, most people aren't. So, and again, even if you wanted, let's say you wanted very good results, because again, if you wanted maximum results, you would throw your baby out, you would throw your wife out, you would lock yourself in a room, and all you would do is eat, train, and sleep and all that. So I don't think anyone wants to do that kind of trade-off. So the amount of people I've seen, so I have a couple of Joe himself, his clients. I have some friends who have some amazing results. There's this buddy of mine, Callum Raystrick, at CR Physique on Instagram. You can see his clients' results. I think his results as good as any coach is going to have. And from what I've seen, he does a reasonable amount of volume. So not definitely not 2 sets per week, but something reasonable. So when just to specify, I'm talking about something like 8, 10, 12 sets per muscle group per week. If you split that up into workouts, that's 4, 6 sets per muscle group per workout. I think that's plenty. If you do 2 sets per 2 actual working sets in that per exercise, and you do 3 exercises per muscle group, that's plenty. And this ties into your RER concern. I agree with you that if you're not going to do that kind of super high undulation, then starting at the 4 rep in reserve baseline is probably exaggerated. The only good side or the only positive side I can see is if someone has issues with technique, this allows them to get in some stimulative work, but also the weight not being so challenging that they just revert back to unsafe or faulty movement patterns, if you want to conceptualize it that way. So if you think about it, once you get in that 1 reps in reserve, 0 reps in reserve failure, by that point you have to be automatic. You can't think about lifting and lift with a weight that's going to crush you. It's just impossible. So by that point, your execution should be dialed in, should be automatic, should be perfect. So by keeping the RER number higher, you actually allow yourself to have some opportunity to practice. Now again, this can be done on warm-up sets, and that's a whole different topic for a different day. But I think that would be the upside of starting at a higher RER number. And as far as the volume tolerance, I agree with you. I was actually thinking about this a while back, that what is the actual time that is needed, I guess, to pass for that particular volume to not be as effective anymore. And again, if you look at the number of people who do only 2 working sets per exercise, and their only progressive overload, if you want to call it that, is increasing weight or reps, and they still make great progress. So I think, again, most people would be much more, they would benefit much more from looking at the quality first and not just mindlessly trying to do these ginormous amount of sets. So before picking up Mike's books and trying to perfectly match their MAV or their set numbers to their MAV and all that, actually review their execution and actually try to get as much out of one set as possible before moving on to that particular line of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. So yeah, man, I think we covered a good amount of ground. I mean, we could talk about some other stuff, such as increasing density, reducing tempo during your training. But maybe at this time we could wrap it up, because we want to make it to the football game that is starting soon. So I don't know, maybe we can do a separate episode on some of those other things, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I have just one final suggestion or recommendation, or whatever you want to call it, for people who are trying to make very good gains, but also be aware of their time spent in the gym and all that. So, and this is what I like to do when I am pressed on time and I only have maybe an hour to work out, something like that. So what I would recommend doing is, again, do 2 working sets per exercise. Do your first regular working set in a moderate rep range, 6 to 10, 8 to 12, whatever, something like that. Take an actual good rest, so 3 minutes, something like that, when you feel recovered. And then do the second set, similar weight, and then do some sort of an intensification technique, just to get some more effective volume in, like Berge likes to call it. And I don't think the particular method matters a whole lot. I don't think one of them is better than the other. Essentially, all of them accomplish the same thing, just accumulating more effective volume. And I like to, and this is what I have started doing actually, since I faced the issue I mentioned previously with trying to increase set numbers, that, well, not many people have 2 hours every day to spend in the gym. Most people have 45 minutes, 60, maybe 75 minutes, something like that. So on that second working set, what you can do is either do a rest pause set, which would mean that you rest for 15, 20, 30 seconds, something like that. And then you try to get in roughly half the initial reps. So if in the first one you got 10, you might try to do another 5. And these should be arguably effective reps in the sense that you have already hit failure. And by the way, these should be to failure. To failure meaning technical failure, meaning once your technique is starting to break down, once you can no longer get high quality reps, you stop. This doesn't mean that
literally can't move anymore.
Exactly. And there are some, again, we can touch another time. And if you're more advanced, you can use Spotter to potentially obviate for some imperfect machines and all that. But that's for another day. So you might just do a rest pause set, or you can do a drop set, or which would mean dropping down the weight by 20%, 30%, something like that. Again, with the goal of getting in more effective reps, usually somewhere between half and three quarters of the original rep scheme.
Awesome.
And if you do that for a muscle group, and if you do that on maybe 2, maybe 3 exercises, that's like 6 working sets per workout. You repeat that again, you get 12 sets. I think if your execution is good and you actually know how to lift, you get as much out of that setup as you can realistically. And if you're a regular guy and a regular gym goer, it doesn't really matter that you could have spent another hour and you could have gotten another 5%, because it really doesn't really matter to you. So that's just a take-home message for people who perhaps just are trying to, maybe they are thinking, okay, great, but what the hell am I supposed to do with all this information? How can I apply this for my own training? That's just my own practical recommendation.
That was great because, many times you listen to an hour-long podcast and at the end, people are just talking about a whole bunch of things, what not to do. You know, this thing is not optimal. You could do better with something else. And at the end of it, you're like, okay, so what the hell do I actually do? So that was great that you gave some actual practical tips. So Andrei, thank you so much for doing this, and hopefully we will be able to hop on some other calls like this and talk about some similar stuff, because I think it can be greatly informative for people. So just let people know where they can find more about your stuff.
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for allowing me a platform to ramble on these topics, because usually I just think about this in my own head, and it's great to have someone to share it with. So if you like this kind of content and you like listening to podcasts, I would recommend checking out my own podcast, where Abel has been a guest on previously, the Muscle Engineer podcast. If you want to get in contact with me, you can find me on social media, on Facebook. I have a business profile, facebook.com/SzotákTME or Szoták Andrei, the Muscle Engineer. You can get in contact with me on my personal profile. That's Szoták András. I guess that's a bit hard for most people to spell. But if you just search for my first name, then you should be able to find me. And the social media account where I'm probably most active on is Instagram. That's just instagram.com/SzotákTME. And there you can find almost daily content. And I also post on my stories daily, 5, 6, 7 times per day, something like that. I post podcasts I listen to, funny stuff I find, the occasional Dragon Ball content if you're into that. I post some research if I see it, something interesting. So essentially just more stuff related to what we discussed here. And if you liked my approach and you would like to work with me, like I said, I also work with clients online. And if you get in contact with me, I can let you know if I have available spots or not.
Cool, man. Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Same here, man. And I really look forward to repeating this again in the future. So that was episode 18 of the Muscle Engineer podcast, with me being featured as a guest on the Sustainable Self-Development podcast. I hope you enjoyed the discussion we had with Abel on the topic of progressive overload. and I hope you find it valuable and got some things you can take away and implement into your own training. So with that, let's get into my top 3 takeaways and things that I would like everyone to get out of this episode and at least consider when it comes to designing their own training routine and setup. So the first and most important point when it comes to the discussion around the progressive overload is defining what actually progressive overload is. So like I said in that episode, progressive overload doesn't mean loading more weight on the bar or doing more reps or doing more sets. It simply means increasing the demands that you place upon the musculature you're trying to target. Of course, this can be synonymous with increasing weights on the bar. However, the big misconception is that automatically assuming that just because you loaded more weight on the bar, that automatically means that you are indeed inducing a progressive tension overload, which is far from the reality. And like I said in the episode, actually the opposite of what happens with most people. And I'm mainly talking about relatively untrained or relatively unskilled lifters, because there are many people who are quote-unquote trained but are still very unskilled and have very shit execution and muscle recruitment even after 5 to 10 years of just casually lifting around. The goal of hypertrophy training is to increase the amount of tension that's placed on the muscle. So in a sense, you're trying to make that muscle contract harder and harder or work harder and harder, and have to essentially, you want to put it under an increasingly higher demand over time. And this can happen in a variety of ways, but you always have to keep in mind that the goal is to make the muscle work harder, and whatever way you achieve that can indeed be deemed as a way of progressive overload. The second point is around things you should focus on when you're a beginner or a relatively new lifter, or simply when you're trying to transition into hypertrophy specific training. Perhaps if you came from a powerlifting background or a weightlifting background or a CrossFit background, something like that, where simply performance was the goal and not necessarily increases in muscle size. So when it comes to that, I absolutely believe that execution should be the foundation first and foremost. You should establish a very, very, very good base of execution before you try to increase loads. And I think this is valuable for 2 reasons mainly. One is that it allows you to get the same result essentially by using a lighter weight, which can be a useful thing simply in practice. If you say you can get the same job done with 150 kilos on the leg press instead of having to use a 250 with a shear form or a short range of motion or with tons of momentum and bounce and all that, then just simply means less time that you have to load up and unload the leg press, which I personally think it's very useful. And the second point is perhaps even more important, and this is often countered by people who say, well, look at so-and-so, look at Branch Warren, look at Doug Miller, look at any of these guys look at them, you're so jacked, and they don't control the weight all that much and just sway it around and they grow like weed, which is true, but also look at the amount of surgeries Branch Warren had. Look at the amount of surgeries Ronnie Coleman had. I mean, okay, great. If that's your role model and you want to join them in a hospital bed eventually, then awesome, have at it. But if you're actually trying to promote longevity and try to do this for a long time, then I think placing execution at the forefront ensures that you can actually lift for years and decades to come, which I think should be the most important thing in mind, not just what you can do in the next 3 or 4 months. And in that sense, my final point is going to be around the progression method you take, and more specifically whether you should try to increase set numbers and try to hit your volume landmarks as popularized by Mike Israel. And if you know me or if you follow me on my Instagram, know that I am coaching people under the supervision of Mike, so I am definitely not a hater. I'm not trying to strawman him. I'm not dismissing him. I absolutely think that he is right in most of the things he says, and I do think that for someone who is really elite and tries to get absolutely single best results and get each percent point out of their training, then awesome. And Mike's programming style is going to get them close to that outcome. However, I think that in practice, there are many issues with taking that approach, largely due to the fact that most people have real lives and they have a very limited time to train, and two, have varying amounts of recovery capabilities, the main one being sleep. So if someone perhaps they have a small child or something, a newborn or something like that, then one night they might get 8 hours of sleep, the other night might get 5 hours, third night they might get 8 again, then they might get 2 hours. So when it comes to practical programming, you can't really want to push these high volume training routines when you face these kinds of practical realities. And the other important consideration is time. I mean, if someone only has 45 to 60 minutes to work out and you can't just sit at the gym however long you want and do 25 sets with 3 reps in reserve because supposedly more volume is better, which is debatable, but let's assume for a second that it is, then it simply becomes what can you get, or how can you get the most out of those 60 minutes. And for that, I think pushing relative intensity higher and trying to hit failure with good technique, and that means that the set stops once you can no longer hit high quality reps. I think that doing fewer sets and emphasizing quality first and foremost, and then pushing relative intensity and getting closer to failure, especially in isolations, is a very fine way to train. And if you implement some of the intensity techniques I mentioned in the podcast, doing things like drop sets or rest pause sets or myo reps or any other similar strategies, you can get the most of your training in a very time efficient manner. And I think even if, let's say, you can only get 90%, because it's not like the super advanced programming is going to get you 100%, and this more simple fewer sets per exercise setup is going to get you 30%. It's more like 80-90% versus 95 100. So even if this setup only gets you quote unquote only 90% of the gains, if that means staying in the gym for 45 minutes versus 2.5 hours, I think that's a worthy trade-off to take. So in that sense, I think for most people, doing definitely more than 3 sets per exercise is overkill, and more than 3 exercises per muscle group per workout is also not needed. So if you're someone who is doing 20 plus sets per workout regularly and you don't really look like a professional bodybuilder, I would really start scrutinizing your workout quality first and foremost, and focus on improving that. So those would be my takeaways. I hope you enjoyed them. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope you found it helpful. And stick around, because in a couple of days I will release another episode, because I had the honor of being once again on Abel's podcast, and this time we discussed the topic of deloads. So this episode is already up on Abel's channel, so if you want to check it out already, you can go to the Sustainable Self-Development Podcast YouTube channel. I think it should be up on his SoundCloud and on iTunes also. But if you're busy and have other things to listen to, then stick around, because I will also release that episode in this podcast in a couple of days. So we'll talk soon, and until then, have an awesome week.